Therapist Thrival Guide, where we cover all of the things that graduate school didn't teach you. Welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda Barker. I am a licensed clinical social worker here at Ellie, and I am joined with my co-host, Lucas Vellini, LMFT.
Podcaster.
And a podcaster. Oh, yeah. Today we are continuing our series on innovations in therapy. And so we brought in one of the really cool programs that's happening at Ellie right now that we want to learn more about and educate y'all about. And maybe you have something like this near you too. Or maybe you live in Minnesota too, and this is something that you could be referring to. So we are going to be talking about virtual reality therapy today, and I am joined by LJ and Austin. Do you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm LJ Taugher. My background's actually originally in nonprofit management and then came back into the psych field. I have a master's in counseling from St. Mary's University, and then worked as a therapist here at Ellie for quite some time, and then also for a while, and then also with Austin created this virtual reality department or program, which we're both program managers for. And then now currently I'm also a doctorate student at St. Mary's. That's kind of
Psychology.
I was going to say doctorate in psychology.
Yep, doctorate and so a PsyD in counseling psychology. Oh, and then also I teach at St. Mary's right now, teaching both emerging trends in psychotherapy, both on psychedelic.
Like virtual reality therapy.
Yeah, both on psychedelic assisted therapy with Kyle Keller and Kyle Ross, and then I teach on tech and therapy, integrating tech into therapy, and then also be teaching psychopathology.
Oh my gosh, this is so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to pick your brain on some of these different emerging therapies and hear more about tech. This is awesome. Okay, cool. Austin?
I am Austin Jacobson, MA, graduated from Adler Graduate School in 2021. That sounds about right. Yeah, sure, let's go with that. Feels like a lifetime ago. I've been working in the mental health field for about a decade. Started off in community-based services, providing in-home work to low-income clients with severe and persistent mental illness. I am now the co-manager of the VR program. I'm also the manager of our CBS Community-Based Services program. I'm a giant nerd. Yeah.
What do you nerd out about?
Everything.
You should see this man's gaming setup.
Seriously.
Really?
Cool.
Yes.
It's so cool.
I've added to it. It's grown.
God, good.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
First time I met Austin, he was doing a presentation, and I had known nothing about him before. He just had like tattoos, and he was talking about like really cool stuff that was like non-traditional. And like the whole time he was presenting, I was just thinking in my head like, he needs to go work at Ellie. Like I think he would love Ellie. And then like his last slide was like, and I work in the community-based program at Ellie Family Services, which it was back then. I was like, oh,
That's awesome.
great.
You found us.
But I wasn't even working there. I was teaching still. But like I was always referring people to Ellie. I always knew it was only a matter of time, you know, until I'd entered over.
Until they got you.
So do you, would the two of you say that being a male therapist with a beard is unoriginal?
Especially since I also have the therapist ponytail.
Yeah. So,
Austin
but I mean,
doesn't have that anymore.
No, I used
You
to
did.
about a year ago, then
Yeah.
chopped off 24 inches of hair.
I remember that.
I miss it.
Gosh, that is funny that all three of you are therapists with beards.
But I only have the therapist hair.
It's true. It's true.
And I'm a podcaster. I think virtual reality therapy is one of those things where, like, I knew there was a program going on here, but I talked about this in a prior episode. Like, any like new modality or therapy, I'm always skeptical. You know, like, and I'm always like, you have to, like, prove me wrong. You know, that this should be something legitimate. And then I met LJ, and like he explained VR to me, and like 3 minutes in, I just like saw all the applications and possibilities, and then he gave me some journal articles to read on it, and like the efficacy. I was like, this is cool. This is useful.
Yeah.
This will be super effective.
Yeah, and actually that's a piece that I think is really kind of cool with VR. I mean, it's something that seems new, but it's actually been around for quite some time. Of really, it was the VA that really started the ball rolling a lot because they did a lot of the initial work with using it with PTSD, of actually getting like VR 3D imaging from combat areas to be able to use in treatment of vets coming back. But like also, Lucas was just saying too, what was really kind of cool was, I think it was about a year ago now, APA published a journal, it's Translational Issues in Psychotherapy. And once a quarter they come out with a journal, and it's always dedicated to one topic. And APA, theirs was on just VR and therapy, which I think was kind of a tipping point to be able to show the research actually backs using this. It's not just a toy. But they were the whole journal was just dedicated to all the different ways, ranging from phobias, like what we've kind of started with, but also then with social phobias, with disasters, with just a whole host of different ways that even the APA is now saying, yes, this is actually really the way to be able to augment the way that we deal with these areas.
And that's when you know you've made it.
Yeah.
Like when the APA dedicates an entire journal. Volume issue?
It's a volume,
So.
Well, and actually, on that note, we say it's a newer thing, but I think the VA, they've actually been using immersive VR with clients since like the mid 90s.
Yeah, it's at least 20 years. 20,
right.
20,
So it's
30.
actually not that new. Certainly not when you compare it to some other modalities and whatnot. And also, fun fact, the first mention of virtual reality was in a book in the 1930s before we had computers. So, yeah.
Virtual reality therapy?
No, just VR.
VR.
Just VR. But point being, it's been
It was a science
for a while.
fiction book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump in a little bit more into like, what is virtual reality therapy? Is it just exposure therapy? Tell me more about what this looks like.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'll kind of start in the inverse, and at least like how we built our program. Our program really did start as an exposure-based therapy, really a take on systematic desensitization and ERP. So, going through those latter runs of distress, slowly, decreasing it over time, thinking about like a client that might have a fear of flying, right? At some point, you need to ask, as a clinician, you need to ask your client to like get on a plane. There's some obvious barriers to that. It's expensive. It's not like you can just go into the airport these days and like wander around and all of that. You can't really bring an airplane like to your office, but you can in the virtual realm. So originally we started off using VR in lieu of in vivo exposure, or like the step right before. We have since actually started to expand that, as Lucas was saying, like the possibilities here really are endless. So we've started to expand it and using VR as a tool in your more like everyday standard psychotherapy, especially in terms of mindfulness and relaxation techniques.
And along those lines too, of kind of the way that we tend to think of it is one of the biggest challenges with being a clinician is, especially when you're taking insurance, is you're tied to the office. And so you run into a point where Imagine If can only take you so far. We can do a lot with Imagine If and watch a video and let's talk about this. And imagine if you were at the airport, to use that as an example. But you hit a point where a client is probably not quite ready to deal with the chaos that is involved with a real situation, but they still need more support. And so we can use this to be able to bring the outside world in and to be able to allow people to be able to engage with different stimuli that usually you would not be able to have in that office environment, and have them do it with their therapist. So we're kind of subdividing into, we have like the more the exposure, straight up like phobias and things that are going to take a little bit more clinical training with it, but also to be able to do anytime that a clinician goes, I wish I could do that with you. I wish I could be there when you, that's a sign to grab a VR headset. Because even if you're not doing full exposure therapy, like with a full protocol of the SUDS ladder and everything else, you can be working with somebody who, let's say they don't have a fear of public speaking, but they got a big presentation. Great. Grab a VR headset, put them in the boardroom, and have them do it with you next to them.
Because one of the things that you guys are really trying to incorporate is not just therapists referring to
Correct.
you, you want therapists to start using these tools just
Correct.
in
Right.
there. I love this.
Yeah, and that's really kind of the main thing is we don't see this as like a specialty per se. This is something that, because for vast majority of what we're looking at, the clinician is still using the exact same therapeutic interventions they would. Like for treating phobias, it's still ERP. It still is exposure therapy. All that we're changing is how the stimulus is sourced. There's a whole different branch, which is newer things. But yeah, so it's really of going, how do we get clinicians to be able to use this using the similar skill sets that they already have?
So you mentioned like the phobias, you mentioned mindfulness. What are some other ways that you would use VR?
Those are really the two biggest ways, at least in the mental health field, that we're seeing right now. If you expand it beyond mental health field, it's being used in like kinesthesiology, it's being used in physical therapy and those more physical realms. It's being used, and a lot of research is going into memory care.
In what way?
In using it as a tool to help aging clients and aging individuals maintain and use their memory. I'll be honest, it's not an area that I actually know that much about. It's certainly not my area of expertise. But that's where a lot of research is happening right now. But bringing it back into the therapy realm, you can even use it in a little bit more creative ways where, I actually, to pull an example from my own week, I have a client, he's actually an EMDR client. He has an upcoming trip. He's flying somewhere, and was recognizing that some of his trauma response was actually bleeding into his excitement actually for this trip. So that excitement was turning into anxiety. So was able to actually like pull out the VR headset, get him into the airplane, and actually like have him bring that distress down and focus on, what that difference between excitement and anxiety is in that space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you would have them, go onto the airplane in virtual reality and then practice like distress tolerance.
Yeah. Or actually with that client, what I ended up doing is he identified a couple of songs that he wanted to listen to for takeoff.
Yeah.
So I pulled those up as well, had them playing along with the VR simulation, and had him notice what was happening as like internally as he kind of transitioned from anxious to excited.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
With that too, within our field of just literally before we sat down to do this, I was pulling up some research for something else that Austin and I are working on. And I was finding that just within the last year, there's like meta-analysis on use of VR and like eating disorders.
Yeah.
And I was also finding ones on like using, again, like with EMDR or with a number of these others of like an example, like with the eating disorders, this is a spot where we start to get into things that you can only do with something like VR. So like an example is in our VR suite, we have an eating disorder VR worlds. And one of them, as an example, is and eating disorders is not my area of expertise, so forgive me, anybody who actually is my understanding is they'll have like a chart of body images and say, which one do you most resonate with, which one do you think is the most ideal body image, and the client self-reports of which one they say it is. Well, self-report is notoriously problematic, and so what we can do is in the VR headset it's a 360 room of all the different body images. And we have, please, pay attention to think about and look at the one that you think you attend to, blah, blah, blah. I can tell which one they're looking at. So we actually see a percentage above for how much time are they attending to that body shape. So we can pick up on the difference between what is their reported value and where were they actually keeping their head.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's kind of an example where we can go beyond just the exposure, and we can start to use the technology to be able to use both the VR, the virtual, and also the data analytics to be able to provide actual reported data and be able to pull back a little bit from the self-reported data and be able to use those to compare would be an example.
Right. That's a lot of the stuff that we're seeing and incorporating like biofeedback into this practice as well. There's some really cool technology out there where it's like a little device that actually goes on the back of your head and you're effectively playing a video game. But to do things in the video game, like it's a side-scrolling one, to jump, let's say, you have to focus on something. Your eyes have to stay on that thing before the character can jump. So imagine if you're working with someone that has like ADHD or even just low attention, being able to get that immediate biofeedback of like, oh, hey, this is what's actually like for me to focus on this one thing. And then beyond that, an area that I'm actually super excited about, we're not quite there yet, but imagine you are working with someone who is questioning their gender identity and gender expression, right? There's some stuff that you can do in real life, but let's say they're fairly early on in that. Well, imagine if they can put on a headset, see themselves in a mirror, and then change whatever bits and pieces and change what their body can actually look like so that it represents how they internally view themselves and how they actually are.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like in all of these examples, really partially what we're doing too is when you do imagine if work, even like drawing things out or things like that, the brain still pretty well knows that it's theoretical, but the use of VR can shift the brain into actually filing this under a lived experience. And that's often really what we're doing. So like in therapy, we're going, imagine if, practice, okay, we just stress tolerance. They go out and have the lived experience, and the brain says, oh, not only is it supposed to work, it actually did. That's what we're going for. So in any of these types of environments, it's that immersion and that sense of I really did the thing rather than I imagined what it would be like to do the thing. And that's really like with the VR what we're leveraging is in the therapy space, in this clinical office, we can give them the immersive, I actually stood in front of that auditorium and gave the presentation.
And it feels real.
Yes.
Right. Because
Well, and that's it. It's not. What convinced me about this stuff is,
yeah.
like, it doesn't just feel real, but the brain can't distinguish that it's not real.
The reaction is absolutely real. So once a month during our new hire orientation, I do a little demo. And of course, I go through my slides, speed through them, and I have, I don't actually want to just talk about this. I want to get people into the headset. It's once you get in the headset, you actually experience it. It's bonkers. But inevitably, I have someone come up. They're like, yeah, I'll do it. I always ask, how do you feel about heights? I think heights is a relatively easy one to start off with. And, about half the time, they're either like, oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Heights are nothing.
Oh, really?
And then the other half of the time, they're like, they're not my favorite, but, I can handle them. And because I'm mean, I put them on top
On the elevator one, right?
I've upgraded, actually.
No.
I put them on top of a crane where they can, look down. They can see through, the struts and everything. And the number of times that people put on the headset and then immediately get that fear response.
Yeah. I don't know if I would believe in VR as much as I do, except that I had an experience like this where I was at a party. We were like, let's throw on the VR headset. It was even a couple years before I came to Ellie, but I am definitely one of those people who's like, I don't love heights, but I can do it. Blah, blah, blah. I could not do it. I put the headset on, and it was the one where it feels like you're going up an elevator, and then you're stepping, and there's a plank in front of you.
Richie's plank experience.
And I lost it.
Yeah.
I tried to walk single file, foot against heel, toe to heel. I could not do it. My brain was suddenly, it was just I was shaking. I had this moment. I mean, everyone is watching me do this, and they're laughing, and I just lower myself to my ankles because I was I can't do this. It is bizarre how.
The cool part with that is, and then as a therapist, it's one of those of going, now think about working with a client as they're having that visceral experience.
Yeah.
And so where it gets really cool is a phrase that we use a lot is the human brain is amazingly complex and incredibly perceptive and incredibly stupid.
It can be
it's just dumb. So the hind part of your brain, which is really processing these responses, doesn't have vocabulary. It doesn't have logic. It doesn't have a way of communicating except through an adrenaline dump. So once that sympathetic nervous system response is going to happen, whether it's a bad CGI or you're actually putting somebody on the edge of the building, that part of the brain that is responsive to a lot of these things that we work with therapists doesn't bloody care.
Danger.
It doesn't care. It doesn't care. And so it is that visceral response that we want, because often as clinicians, that client is experiencing that visceral response without us there.
Yeah.
They're actually dealing with the spider. They're actually dealing with the flight. They're actually dealing with the MRI machine without us present. This allows us to be able to use that fear, that response that you had walking that plank, and actually be able to use that as an in vivo response. Yeah. It's really fun.
So, like other trauma modalities, you would work up to it? You would kind of be like, okay, we're gonna walk into the airport. And so you would do it in that way. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And oddly enough, actually, for flying, it's been landing has been like the lowest run. The idea with all my clients with fear of flying, it's always the same. The thought is, it's because we're done.
I don't understand.
Like for my clients that have like a fear of flying, when they're landing, that's when they're finding their anxiety to be the lowest.
Yeah.
Because they have that thought of like, we're done, versus like takeoff, or even like worse is sitting on the tarmac before takeoff.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I'm stuck in this metal tube for however many hours.
They don't know when it's going to start.
Yep.
Right.
So it's almost like the climax, or however you would okay.
So of course, like, it depends on the client. You know, you actually don't want to start too low. But you certainly don't want to just like flood them right away, at least not without doing the appropriate resourcing right beforehand. There is, I think, a time and place for that.
Yeah.
But
Shout out to my friends who flooded me at that party. Right there.
That's a whole different approach.
Yeah.
But I think, like, an example of, like, I was working with a client who had vomit phobia, and we started with her in line for a movie
Okay.
with plenty of way to be able to run.
Yeah.
You know, but so that was like, she was able to do that, but was still pretty freaked out. But she's had that sense that if she needed to escape, she could. The worst one was getting on a plane. So we were able to use VR from week to week, switch from waiting in line for a movie. We had her giving a presentation in front of a hostile classroom. And then moved on to having her actually watch somebody throw up, to getting on a plane.
To giving her Epicac.
Basically, yeah, pretty close. But anyway, so I mean, that's the other part too, is there's so many different VR worlds that as the clinicians, we have the flexibility and the judgment to pull in the worlds that are unique to that individual and tailor the experience to being that exactly what's happening for them, rather than something that's just, here's like the vomit phobia suite. We can actually put these together to create a treatment modality and a treatment plan that is tailored to that individual.
I bet you don't have a world to address my fear.
Oh, what's your fear?
An eternal afterlife.
Actually, we probably do.
Yeah.
You know what the eternal afterlife is?
Well, we'd probably switch over. Remember, before I also helped teach on psychedelic assisted therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Put that.
Yeah, I just need psychedelics.
Yeah, put that in with the VR. Yeah.
Which might happen.
Actually, we were kind of joking and laughing. This is actually a piece that we're looking at. And actually,
VR
I've been
and psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, actually, there's a company called Firefly that I was that I did evaluated and did feedback for, of using VR with psychedelic assisted therapy. That was actually really pretty fun. So that's a whole different.
That seems
that's a whole
scary.
different
So many avenues.
Yeah.
I even like doing, I love doing open chair work, like that old Gestalt method.
Yeah.
Which is another thing we teach, as if it's like ancient and archaic, because that's powerful. It's like, I love open chair work. Like augmented realities around the corner too.
Yeah.
What does open chair work mean?
Open chair work is like all your unfinished business is with your dad who died 5 years ago, and so you pull in an open chair.
Yes.
But like what's powerful about it is, it's like they can't. You shift them from telling you about their disowned parts, and they have to say it to the chair, like in the first person, as if they're actually there. It's so powerful.
That
And
is
to be honest, actually, Luke, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think open chair, in a way, is a precursor to how we're doing VR.
Oh, it is.
That's
the next phase of its evolution.
It really is, because I think that's awesome, because that Gestalt, Fritz Perl type approach of that, you're trying to trick the brain into feeling like it had a lived experience, and that's what open chair does.
Yeah.
Is it elevates it from the imagine if to actually, like, the brain is thinking it's having that conversation with the person who's passed, and it files it under that lived experience rather than the imagine if, even though they know full well their father has been dead for 10 years. Their brain still will file it under the real lived experience, and that's kind of what we're doing, like with the VR.
Yeah, and like so what I was most interested in was like the neuroscience behind this, because I was like, this has to be working at the neurological level, or else they wouldn't be getting this efficacy. And like the two things we miss when we think about clients just imagining these things is, one, I think therapists tend to be more creative people, and more creative people have more vivid imaginations, but not everyone does.
No.
Like, not everybody has like these rich visuals and scenarios that they can create in their
So
mind.
true.
Right.
Yeah.
And even for people who do have a rich imagination, so much of your brain's energy, if not all of your brain's energy, is being put toward creating that imaginative scenario.
Yeah.
And so you don't have much
You're
other
not processing
bandwidth.
it. You're not processing as
But
much.
the VR just puts you in
Right.
it.
Well,
and
that
that's
actually-
the difference of like why we can't massage. It doesn't feel good when we massage ourselves, but it feels good when someone else does, because when we massage ourselves, our brain's processing too much information by the bilateral
Well, you're
tactile.
not tricking yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'm glad actually you brought up the neurology too, because when you think about of how do we process actual visual stimulus versus of imagined.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is using some different neurology. And again, back to, we want it to file on a real lived experience. If that's actually coming through the visual cortex rather than, the other regions of the brain that are involved with imagination, you're going to have, that's going to get filed as I was seeing this rather than,
And when you're having an emotional experience while that's happening, it's like that's integration.
It is.
That's what we're aiming for.
It is. That's
That
so much fun.
explains why when I have dreams that my husband cheats on me, it
You
feels
wake up
so
feeling-
real.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
wake up
pretty
pissed.
much.
You wake up angry.
Well, because your brain is filing, again, if your brain is filing it under this was real, you're going to have that response
Yeah.
of going, this is real.
You guys, this is so cool. Like,
So much
oh
fun.
my gosh. Okay, tell me more about the research. What we keep kind of dancing around. There's efficacy here.
There is. This was a piece that I looked at when we pitched this, when we first designed the program, because we had to pull together a full proposal and send it to the executive committee and get it, by the chief clinical officer and all the fun stuff. And so we pulled the research. And this was a couple of years ago, and just this morning I was re-looking at the current research because I wanted to see what's now. There's some awesome meta-analysis that are literally, I wanted just this within 2022 that have been published. And really the short version is all the trials do show that it is as effective as in vivo. And the key part with that is, since the clinical outcomes and the longitudinal research behind it for, does this hold for as long as it does for in vivo, holds true, that means that we can have those same clinical outcomes without having to find how to be with our client on top of a building. And we can still actually have that behind it. The eating disorders one is still a little bit shakier. There's not quite as much research there. But with phobias there is, and I think with trauma, that's
Eating
actually showing
disorders
pretty
are
closer
like
to.
much more challenging variables
Yeah.
you're working with.
Yeah.
But like the only data point that really mattered was like how long the efficacy lasted relative to in vivo, because that's what's demonstrating the same things happening in the brain.
I'm surprised it's not more effective.
Well, it should be the same. Theoretically, it
Theoretically,
should
it
be
should be the same,
exactly the same.
because
That
the brain-
would be the target.
Right, because the brain either way, whether it's VR or in vivo, is saying I did the thing. So we should really be seeing similar type of clinical outcomes.
And what makes VR the preferred alternative to in vivo then is its
It's
accessibility.
accessibility.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
it's the accessibility, the fact that you can do the exposure with your therapist. Again, with in vivo, unless you have a therapist come with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's not afraid of heights? Rule
Right.
out Barker.
Rule out Barker.
Yeah.
And to Miranda's point, I could actually see where VR might be a little bit more effective is because you're doing the exposure with the therapist right there. The therapist can come in and help strengthen those neural pathways.
Correct.
Yes.
Right. So instead of just relying purely on the desensitization, the therapist can help guide a little bit, and actually, kind of like what I was doing with my other client, help attach the positive side or attach the parasympathetic nervous system side to something else and just strengthen it, that little tiny bit more.
Another piece too that I thought was very interesting, again, just in preparation for this, I was reviewing actually all their articles from that APA publication.
Nerd.
Yeah, I know. You'd think I was getting a doctorate in this stuff or something. But I was taking a look at it, and they had a cool one in there for accessibility of being able to use, rather than we use like a full VR headset type deal, they have ones that you can use a cell phone that has like a kind of a device that you can put over it.
Yeah.
I won't go into the details of it, but the long story short was the research article was on being able to do some of this exposure remotely. So the clinician and the client aren't even in the same room.
Like by telehealth.
Yeah, pretty much. And so you can use the cell phone with
It's like a
You
Google
can get them
Go
for
or
like
something,
$10 now.
Yeah,
On
they can get them
Amazon,
really
like all
pretty
the
cheap.
knockoffs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Link in the description.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, we'll find it. I'll send it. So we can use that VR for them to be having that in vivo experience and do it by telehealth. We're not doing that currently, but it's the research in the APA journal that was one of the. I think that was actually the first article in that publication was on the use of treating flying phobia remotely using VR.
And there are some programs out there that do that, like that. That's all they do.
Yeah.
They are, in my mind, prohibitively expensive currently.
Sure.
Yeah.
But then I want to go back to something that Lucas was saying a little bit before, again, of that imagine if piece. So again, I do EMDR. One of our main resources in EMDR is safe space. So, I'm asking someone to, think of a space that they find calming and safe and whatnot, and then imagine it, blah, blah, blah. I've had a few clients now where they know of a space that is calm, but they can't imagine it, like, at all. It's just blank, right? Well, then it's like, well, shit, let's throw the headset on you. You find a beach calming. Okay, let's put you on
the beach.
Yes.
And the inverse of that actually is, I was again doing EMDR with a client. A single incident, he had fallen from a ski lift.
This was awesome.
Yeah. We got it down to about like a 6 or so on distress, just wouldn't go any further. And then I was about to have a conversation with him around like, I think this might be the most that we can do at this point in time. And the week that I was about to have that conversation with him, the program that we used came out with a ski lift module. I was like, okay, let's do this.
There we go.
Here, let me just stop you right there
Yeah.
for a second. If I've fallen off a ski lift, I think I'd be like, I'm okay with not going on a ski lift
Yeah,
again.
I'm just not going to ski anymore.
I'm like, done.
Yeah.
I don't even really ski for that
Yeah.
reason, and that's never happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dude is going every weekend and going off jumps.
Stop
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you had a great one with spiders.
Yeah. I was working with a client, pretty intense fear of spiders. Like when we started
That's not
off.
pathological. It just makes sense.
We should talk.
I think spiders are wonderful. They are great. They are good for the environment. Anywho, you're wrong. When we were starting off in the virtual environment, I had her sitting at a table, like a kitchen table, with a laptop in front of her with one small spider that was not moving under a glass jar. And her immediate distress was around a 7 or 8, like pretty high. Yeah. By the time we were done, I had 100 different spiders of different sizes crawling around in front of her, one of them on her hand, perfectly fine, like a 0 out of 10. Had her go into another environment where it's like a creepy, like basement sort of place, like the place that you'd find spiders, with some crawling around on the walls, one dangling from the light, cool as a cucumber. She told me after we were done with the exposures that actually a couple of days before she came in, she was working from home, and a spider crawled out from like behind her monitor. And instead of like screaming for her partner and leaving and letting her partner take care of it like she would have in the past, she reached over, grabbed a Kleenex, picked up the spider, took care of it, threw it away.
Yeah.
That was after 5 exposure sessions.
Wow.
And you know what I love about that stuff too is like what's actually happening there. It's not about spiders. It's not about phobia. It's about her coming into an experience where she is capable of so much more than she's told herself before, that she's stronger than she led herself to believe, and that if she can overcome that, they look at everything differently from that point forward.
Yeah.
You're going to make me tear up. Oh, this is so cool. So I know that we talked a second ago about how we want more therapists to be able to do this. We don't want to just like have to refer people to this. How would I as a therapist know, like, oh man, maybe I should pull out a VR headset for this client? Like who would be is there anyone that wouldn't be a good fit for this sort of program or this intervention?
Very, very good questions.
I think for population wise, not really.
Okay.
It's because even I was like initially, I'm like maybe psychosis. I'm like, well,
No, there's even
No.
research into distress tolerance with psychosis and being able to like shift your focus from auditory and visual hallucinations to actual reality and grounding type stuff.
What about if you are someone who gets like motion sick?
oh yes, you're right. Yes,
Okay.
yeah,
Well-
it's more of a caution
Right.
than
Okay.
than a no.
The motion sickness is something that you can train out. So with VR, where the motion sickness is coming from is your eyes are telling you you're moving, but your inner ears, as I hit the microphone, are saying, nope, you're sitting still. So your brain is confused. You can you can desensitize yourself. You can train your brain to that. So it's still something that you can use. It would just take a little bit longer.
I have to laugh though because the one client that I would like wanted to hurl because she had the vomit phobia.
Oh,
She didn't have any motion sickness. I'm like,
come on.
damn.
Well, and that does actually talk to the.
This is the one that I actually wanted to have motion sickness.
It does talk to how technology has progressed. So the first time I tried VR was 8 years ago or so. I could only have the headset on for maybe 5 minutes before I wanted to hurl, and that it stuck with me. So anyone that's trying this, don't try and push through the motion sickness.
stop.
Yeah.
Stop it, take it off, let yourself calm down.
Yeah, that's no
then put
time
it
for
back on.
heroism.
No,
No, because
Like-
you'll get an association that you
Right.
don't want to have.
Yes. But again, that was like almost immediate for me. And now with the resolution and the refresh rate and like just the advances in technology, I can play VR damn near all day.
Oh, that's
and be
crazy.
fine.
And like,
Yeah.
so like I've done the goggles with the phone, and like that's cool. But like the first time I put on my son's Oculus,
Yeah.
I was like, this
It's
is
so amazing.
unbelievable. And like what I love about that, and I didn't see this coming, it's like you don't have as much motion sickness because like if you step out of a perimeter, you just see the room
Yeah,
all
it
around
flips.
you.
Yeah.
Like it's insane.
Yeah.
It's just simulated
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
if you're in it, and then like you're balanced again and you feel in control again.
Yep.
Yeah.
But speaking of flooding, one of the first games I got my son was Creed. You know,
Oh, yeah.
so I wanted to
Boxing.
fight people.
Yeah.
And so my daughter, she was like, she was 8, and she wanted to put it on and try it, and I was fighting Drago, you know, and so I put him on her, and she just screams because it's like this is
Yeah, it's
it's a
coming at her.
ginormous Russian man,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, trying to kill you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was terrified.
Poor Coco.
And it took a while to, desensitize her back to it, but now she loves it.
Luckily, you have a little
And
trailer.
now
But it's so
she
real.
loves fighting.
Yeah.
Well, but with
Annihilates
when,
Drago.
when talking about those various different games, it's interesting because we tend to, and Austin's more proficient with this, is there's a difference between commercial off-the-shelf games and clinically designed games. Programs that are designed at times Austin's grabbed, a commercial off the shelf and augmented it to be able to use it. But like vast majority, like the programs that we use, these are actually designed by MDs, psychologists, of, people clinicians, and these worlds are designed specifically for clinical use. So like, for example, like the Heights one, we have full control over that world. So we can change at will the parameters. Like if somebody's like, there's a bridge that goes across like a 30th floor from one building to the other. And a click of a button, we can change it from having concrete sides to that walkway to having them be rope to having them be gone. And why I say that is because this isn't these types of programs that we're using for some of these, you're not going to see just in the Oculus store.
Yeah.
These are actually ones that are purpose built for clinical applications. And so some of them are the CGI where we have that control, like Austin was saying, like with the spiders. At the click of a button, he could change how many spiders there were. Or one for my vomit phobia, I could change the audience in the auditorium from 5 people to 100 in a click of a button. that's different than, the fighting game that Lucas was just describing.
Mm-hmm.
And those also we have ones that have those full control, and then we have ones where they set up the VR camera in that space.
Mm-hmm.
So like the one for like the classroom, there's 3 of them. There's 3 worlds that are set. The first one is in front of the classroom, and the class is all attentive and smiling and sitting quietly and listening. And the next one, they're kind of restless. And by the last one, they just so don't care what the hell you're doing. And they're just talking to each other, and they're just like getting up and leaving. And so they, even with the camera in the room progression, these are designed specifically for clinical applications to be able to use. Which is a little different than the commercial off-the-shelf that you might see.
And I think that's kind of a crucial bit to doing this work is, while the telehealth style is cool, and I'm excited to see where that goes, I think it is critical that the clinician actually maintains that sort of control and can use their own like clinical judgment of when to pull back a little bit, or maybe even when to push the client a little bit.
Yeah.
And there's other things that we can do with these programs. Like most of them have breathing aids. So I usually start with them turned off, but if a client is really struggling, I can turn on this breathing aid, which shows like a little dust circle sort of thing that expands. And the idea being that as it expands, you breathe in. As it contracts, you breathe out.
With that, there was a really cool one. I had a client in CBS, in community-based, that I actually took a VR headset to their house. Because trying to work with the guy, he had ADHD and was just having such a hard time like imagining the beach. And he's like, oh, should there be clouds? Should there be a duck? Am I sitting on a chair? And I mean, just he was so focused, he was so trying to like imagine the space. We couldn't get the guy to breathe. The breathing was because he was so like, so I just put him on the beach. And and why I'm saying that is because we removed that aspect that was causing a barrier.
Yep.
And then with that, the program that we were using had that breathing visual, so it gave him something to attend to, something that was moving, something that was eye-catching, and he was able to use that more effectively than me trying to do that imagine if, because the way that his imagination worked, that was actually becoming counterproductive to, it was actually about the breathing. It wasn't about these other things. And so we were able to use this to be able to reduce the barriers.
I'm just trying to think through like other applications for this and other ways that you would use this. Is there any sort of virtual reality that could be beneficial? I mean, you mentioned like psychosis, but like what about depression or like, do you know, what would that even be like?
Yeah, so I believe there is actually a couple of purpose-built programs specifically for depression. They're not ones that I've looked into yet, but by my understanding, they are implementing more of like, again, that mindfulness-based practices.
Oh, sure. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think, though, too, I mean, even when you're thinking about like depression, a lot of those like behavior activation type things that we'd want the person to be doing, I think at times a person can be creating reasons why they can't do it, like familiarity, I don't know how, I don't know where. And you can use these to be able to help them feel comfortable that they're capable of doing. So again, you can give that lived experience of like, of going out and doing an activity. It can bridge that gap between I haven't done it in 5 years, and then we can give them the experience of like walking out in the park or something like that, so that it makes it a little bit more accessible.
Yeah.
And kind of reminds them of going.
Dopamine intervention.
That too. Yeah, I mean, really. I mean, you can put them into this pleasant, more relaxing space. Yeah. It's gonna help with these type of things.
So, just as we're starting to kind of wrap up, I'm curious, where do you see this going in the next few years? It seems like this has changed so much in like just the research. Everything has gone leaps and bounds. But especially with your background of like. Yeah, I'm curious.
I do. And
I would maybe just add to that question before you answer it. What are some potential pitfalls? Like, how could this go wrong?
You're correct. And that's always my question.
Yeah.
We can always come up with the cool stuff, but we run into problems. But really the way I look at it is when we first adopt new technology, and this comes from the class I teach, of when anytime that we're trying to integrate new technology, we first do what's kind of called think of it as hot miking, of like when radio first came out, they just put a microphone onto Shakespearean actors and said, do the thing. And it didn't work quite right. It was better than nothing, and it was getting Shakespeare out to people that usually wouldn't. But it wasn't really the most effective use of that technology. So right now, even like with the exposure therapy, we're kind of hot micing it, where we're taking the therapeutic intervention that we have and the one that has been used, and we're just changing how the stimulus is delivered. So we're not changing anything. We're just using VR to be able to help it. What I'm fascinated to be able to see is what are the things in therapeutic interventions that can only be done using virtual reality. Like I was saying, I think an example would be like the eating disorder of how can we use that visual tracking to actually augment how we're engaging in the actual underlying construct that we're trying to achieve rather than just the surface level. So like using that of going, what is the therapeutic intervention accomplishing to be able to treat, fill in the disorder? What are aspects of virtual reality or really any tech that is unique that we can actually do something new? The problem is it's new, so I don't know what it is. But if I can, a different example would be of like use of tech is like with attention deficit. There's great research on that of tying cognitive load with behavior. So like, which would be like organized sports, of where the person has to attend a stimuli, but there's a behavioral component involved with it. We can use that often, though, with people with ADHD, of sports aren't that great because then you also have the social component, which can go a little bit awry. We can use this to be able to create a whole new intervention that is leveraging those two concepts, but use exergaming, so in-home gaming using VR or using other programs to be able to make that a new therapeutic intervention that otherwise would be impossible to be able to do.
And
That's
that's such a brilliant kind of checkpoint.
Yeah.
Because in so many industries, we develop technologies just for the sake of developing technologies. We do it just because we can.
Yes.
But we don't ever ask ourselves, like, is this purposeful?
Yes.
What are the unintended possible consequences of it? And so, like, when you say that, like, exactly how you framed it, that was brilliant.
Yeah.
Like, unless we can hypothesize at least a function
Yes.
that no other current modality could get at, it's like, let's do it. Because I literally don't know if I've ever said what I actually do at Ellie in any of these episodes. But I oversee our innovation department.
Right.
So, like, I live in the world of innovation, and it's developing new things, keeping, track of new trends, getting ahead of new trends. And so it's like, like psychedelic therapy, virtual reality therapy. Like, this stuff's, it's proved its merit. I already covered, like, convince me that this is worthy. But then also, it's like innovation, a huge component of innovation in general is thinking ahead of unintended possible consequences.
Yes.
And so, like, even when we ask, like, possible interventions for depression, it's like, what worries me about that is, what would maybe make the most sense is, people who are experiencing depression lack desirable experiences in their life.
Correct.
So let's put them in a virtual reality simulator where they can start to experience things that they desire.
Right.
But what gets problematic about that is a number of things, which is one,
They'll never want to leave.
well, and it's like, honest, like, people might think this is crazy. It's not crazy at all. Like, within our lifetimes, we will experience a matrix. Like, we're on the brink of it, where there's a virtual simulated reality that feels increasingly more and more like real life that we can check into. We'll see people start to get jobs in these various virtual realities because the most robust virtual reality is going to be developed by a company, and you'll pay to access it, and they'll need people to live within it. And so it's like, that's going to happen. We're on track to that. And so in some ways it's inescapable, but when it comes to healthcare and therapy, it's like, let's not give them an experience that's more desirable than anything they'll ever actually be able to replicate in real life.
I agree.
To challenge that a little bit, though, that's already happening.
Oh, yeah. We're on.
People are already, thinking about some of the largest MMOs, massively multiplayer online games. Like, there are people that their entire living is derived from, making things in these games and selling those things for real life money.
All
to
these
other
e-commerce
players.
platforms, like V-Bucks, it's like it's already happening, and it's going to become like mainstream outside of the gaming community.
Have you guys seen Wall-E?
Yeah.
It
Have you
just
seen
reminds
Free Guy?
No, but
Yeah.
That's prophecy.
That's good.
With your thought though of my first thought is Mackenbaum, I think it was. He's the one that focused on 19 ways to spot a fad in psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Awesome article.
Yeah.
That's one to actually put in the link.
Yeah,
hate
I will.
fads.
I think that's one of the main ones is going. Any of these have the risk of having people who are more profit driven than clinical driven.
Yeah.
And I think this is really a piece that you're right, Lucas, of we have to, as clinicians, whenever we're dealing with anything that's emerging, we have to be the ones who are actually vigilant to be sure of, is this actually on the up and up? Because like Mackenbaum, he goes through it and going, is this how to be able to, I think his phrase is how to spite hype. But there are certain ways that we're going to run into where people are just looking to make a profit, and their clinical interventions are actually not overseen by clinicians.
Right.
They just sound good, and we
Oh yeah,
really are gonna
like
have to
virtual
measure.
reality. It's like, why can't they say it's like we're not therapists, but it's like we'll give you a virtual reality experience that can be healing.
Well, let me give you an example that's actually not VR. If there's a great example of there was a guy who created an app that was for substance use disorder. Of they wanted to be sure that people weren't putting themselves into triggering situations, like being around drug dealing and things. So they created this app that geofenced all the areas where drug dealers are, so that when the person's phone was approaching that area, it sent them a warning saying that they're near drug dealers. Somebody with substance use disorder, they created a tracking device to find the best drug dealers. Is what the end result was.
So
or
funny.
another one where there was an AI that was for helping, an AI chat therapist to be able to help with depression, except for when the symptoms got bad, started telling them to drink. So in both cases, these programs were created by people who were driven by profit, rather than because on the surface they sounded good. But any clinician would be like, "Oh my God!"
You do really need to take a look at both the intent and the impact.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so we have to, when these things are emerging, VR or any of these, we as the clinicians do have to be the ones to go, really?
Yeah. And those people you were just talking about, what they figured out now is, all right, we can't get away with this on our own, so let's just seduce some people out of medical school, call them chief medical officer, pay, start them off at $500,000 a year, and make it credible.
Correct.
Do it through the healthcare industry and field. That's the corporatization of mental health that we're seeing right now.
And this is just a subject to that.
Yeah.
I mean, it runs the exact any sort of that risk, and we have to be sure that we're safeguarding.
So, out of curiosity, let's talk insurance. Like, how is this covered? Is it covered?
So obviously you can't speak to every state and all of that, but since it is all evidence-based practices, it's built on evidence-based practices, we are able to bill insurance.
You're just doing outpatient therapy.
Hell yeah.
Correct. Because it's exposure therapy, it's ERP. All that's changing for like that piece is the sourcing the stimulus.
Yeah.
That's all.
It's a tool.
All right. So like if LJ and I, let's say we're both working with clients who have depression, we're both using CBT, we're both doing like cognitive restructuring stuff. I use worksheet A, he does something with a whiteboard. We're doing the same thing, just different modalities or different ways of doing that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
You just identified the longest running fad in the history of therapy.
Health insurance?
CBT.
CBT.
Yeah, don't get me started on that.
As you know that's
I
actually
have
what we're
opinions.
doing, right?
Yeah, I know, but I still have
No.
CBT.
still have opinions.
Well, on that note, any other last things that we didn't get to, like frequently asked questions, things that you feel like people should know?
One, which is with the treatment for phobias of it's about 6 sessions.
Oh, okay.
It's not it's shorter duration.
Yeah.
And kind of the way that it's currently operating is it would be in conjunction with if somebody has a therapist, this would be a brief side piece. They would still stay with their therapist. They would just come for the exposure piece, the treatment of this, and still be working with their therapist long term.
It can also be its own standalone thing, or like I've mentioned multiple times with some of my clients where I'm doing different types of psychotherapy and then using VR on occasion. Like there's different ways to go about that.
Yeah.
There's something else I was going to say, but then I forgot what. So here we are.
Thank you guys so much for joining and
welcome.
sharing
Yeah.
all of this knowledge. I am blown away. This is so cool.
So cool.
Yeah.
I would say my final thought is one of my favorite writers right now is Yuval Noah Harari. And one of my favorite books by him is 21 Problems for the 21st Century. And so he's like big, like forward thinker. This guy lives his life in 3 months of complete isolation and silence, and 3 months being engaged writing. And he says that if you ask someone what the world's going to look like 50 years from now, and what they say sounds a lot like a science fiction movie, that they're probably wrong. But if you ask someone what the world's going to look like in 50 years and their answer sounds nothing like a science fiction movie, they're most certainly wrong. And so it's like the world, and before this, Austin and I were talking, like science fiction has often predicted the future. And the science fiction of today is all about simulated realities,
Yes.
you know, and AI and all
Yep.
the different ways things can go wrong. So it's like that's coming
It
in
will.
some form, and we'll see it in our lifetime. And so on the one hand, it's like the future's going to be super fucked up. On the other hand, it's going to be so great.
Yeah.
Well, you were actually asking, or you both were asking earlier, like, where do we see this going? That's actually where I see this
Yeah.
going, is the combination of AI and VR. So, again, I do a lot of trauma work. Imagine if I'm able to type into a VR or an AI thing, hey, create this room or,
Yeah.
whatever, create this space that is where a trauma happened, and use that in VR as, like, that last step in EMDR.
Amazing.
Again, combining, like, that's where I see it going. That's also, like, terrifying
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I'll end on that.
It's a good thing we have ethics.
Right.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. See you next week.